Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. This is basically a response to a video request of one of my patrons. So, if you ever want me to do a video or a stream on some topic or question or issue pertaining to, pretty much either theology or philosophy, you can do that by becoming a patron. And, it's also a great way to support my content here if you want to see more of it on a more regular basis. So definitely check out the details of that below in the description or comment section. That's patreon.com/classicaltheist. And another thing that I'll be adding to that Patreon, by the way, starting in April, is I'm going to start to do some exclusive streams. I'll upload some of them to YouTube generally, but exclusive streams, and the exclusivity is mainly being able to participate directly in the discussions. But they're going to be streams dedicated to commenting on St. Thomas's commentary on all of the Psalms that he did comment on, and I feel like that's just going to be a wonderful way to immerse ourselves a little bit more in a bit more of a theologically rich way in the Psalms, which serve as a foundational bedrock of the church's liturgical prayer. So I think it'll be spiritually beneficial, theologically helpful, and I'm just kind of excited to do it. But that will be a perk for patrons, at least to directly participate in, and not all of them will be uploaded to YouTube. So that's another thing that you might, if you're interested in, Patreon is the way to go for that. And of course, if you end up liking this video, give it a thumbs up, let me know what you think in the comments, and hit the subscribe button and the bell to get a notification when I go live or upload a video. It does really help the channel, and it helps you if you like this channel. So, okay, so on to this patron's question. Well, his main question has to do with, it's an epistemological issue, so the basic reliability of our intellectual faculties when it comes to the transcendent. So, theology, metaphysics, natural theology, these kinds of things. So in other words, if our capacity to discern the truth of things, especially in these immaterial dimensions of truth, if that can only be operative, if that capacity of ours can only be operative firstly through its engagement with the sensible order, then what justification do we have for trusting in those faculties to reliably convey truths to us about that which is incorporeal, immaterial, and therefore transcendent? Moreover, this issue is compounded by various evolutionary theories of human origins, which, if true, could only add to this epistemological problem. So I'd like to address this whole issue today. First things first, though, when we're approaching this whole issue of the reliability of our critical faculties, which is of course a common problem in epistemology and philosophy, we should first get a sense of how St. Thomas defines, or how he articulates, how he gets at the ontological nature of the human mind itself. Because once this is adequately understood, I think his theory of knowledge, while not self-evident, I think will begin to take on a more of a persuasive force of its own just by being understood correctly. And I think that's true in other domains of thought as well. A proper understanding of what he says does a lot of the work in making it appear intellectually persuasive. So how does St. Thomas define the human mind then, and how does he go about explaining what is involved in the act of knowledge on part of the knowing subject? That's an important foundational dynamic that we should understand. Well, I think we first should be contextualizing the human intellect within a broader metaphysical picture of reality so that we can appreciate a little bit more fully the richness of the medieval theories of cognition. So according to St. Thomas and others who think like him, cognitional activity, intellectual activity, the activity of the mind, isn't some fundamentally unique kind of category of being that bears no resemblance to the non-cognitional or even non-living realm of being. All of these categories on this view relate to each other analogically across a hierarchically ordered chain of being. that is much more integrated. And it's this chain of being where excellence or nobility, the higher grades of being, these are determined by the degree to which a thing more or less participates in the full richness of what is supereminently contained in being itself. So being in which everything in the chain participates in. Nobility and excellence is determined by the degree to which individual beings or kinds of beings participate more richly in what is contained within being itself. So as you can see, this is more of an integrated vision of the cosmos. This is an integral cosmos. So at the bottom of the chain, we have, of course, the world of inanimate matter, which is in one sense characterized by its bare bones participation in like just being itself. But in another sense, one can maybe more accurately characterize this level of being by how unlike being itself it really is, because the higher you go up this chain of being, the more a thing is manifesting the full richness of being. And so each layer of this hierarchy is marked by a greater or a lesser degree of participation in being as such. And what determines its rank, I would say, is the degree to which a thing's participation in being is more or less self-possessed, more immanently contained in its perfective activity. So inanimate matter, for example, receives being and perfection, but entirely from without itself. It merely receives. It doesn't act of itself for the sake of its own perfection. And I think we can all intuit that. But then when you enter into the first instance of life, now one's participation in being transitions from mere passivity now to immanent activity. Perfective activity, present within oneself, and that activity is self-possessed in a certain way. In other words, a living thing is living in the measure that its principle of activity, its principle of action, source or cause of activity, is immanently contained within itself. It acts for the sake of itself, and it acts of itself for the sake of itself, for its own perfection. That's what determines living things. So from plants to mammals, really, this takes on higher and higher degrees of immanence until you get to the life of the intellect, of course, which is now characterized precisely by its immateriality. Or we could say its immaterial self-possession of being. That is to say, cognitional activity is the proper activity of an immaterial substance by virtue of its immateriality. And what does it mean to be immaterial? Well, to be immaterial means, again, now this is returning to this concept of self-possessed being. To be immaterial means that your act of existence, your possession of being, is subsistent. Which is to say that the act of being of an immaterial substance is not for the sake of its perception in matter, which is the case with all other living creatures. They have a form, they have we would call a soul, a principle of self-motion, but it's for the sake of its body. It's purely for the sake of the body that it animates. But that's not the case with the intellect. Again, we're talking about a degree of being, a grade of existence that where being is more self-possessed. It's more immanently contained within itself. And so the act of being of an immaterial substance, it's not for the sake of its reception in matter, but is possessed immanently for the sake of itself, independently of matter. And what this means is that intellection, intellectual activity, is ultimately defined by existential subsistence, or the act of being that is self-possessed being. Therefore, to be intellectual is really none other than to be at its most, or in its most excellent mode of expression. And as the highest instance of creaturely being, intellection reveals not so much something other than being, but the plenitude of being and its full existential richness. And so what I'm really trying to get across here is that when we understand the nature of the human mind, this follows a certain progression that includes and encompasses all of reality, all of creation, which should help us to, at least on a more intuitive level, understand that these problems of knowledge, these problems of epistemology, we should be approaching them not as I think often happens in modern problems of epistemology, we approach the mind as some weird exception to the rest of creation. And I think that tends to be the informal starting point of a lot of these problems, a lot of these skeptical narratives about the human mind. I think it gets off on the wrong metaphysical foot by thinking of the human mind as some exception to the rest of creation, and not what it really is, which is the apex of this progression of this hierarchy that includes the rest of creation as well. I think Fran O'Rourke puts it very well, who authors this book called Studia Dionysius and the Metaphysics of Aquinas, where he says, quote, "It is precisely as beings that living and intellectual creatures are living and intelligent. The perfections are not separate but spring from being itself, are concentrated and rooted within it. Just as life includes virtually within itself as one of its possible determinations the perfection of wisdom, so does being embrace life, although it extends beyond living things, so as to contain also inanimate beings." So right out of the gate, we can understand the very nature of the mind as a direct participation in what is actually characteristically divine. That is, as I've said before, self-possessed perfective activity that has as its object not the matter of its own body, but universal being as such. And because the human intellect is itself already a participation, therefore, in the divine intellect, there is within itself some inbuilt, divinely instituted capacity to make potentially intelligible forms that exist in knowable substances, which are, by the way, eminently contained within the simplicity of being itself. The human mind has this capacity, this divinely instituted capacity, to make these potentially intelligible forms go from a state of potentiality to actuality. So from potentially intelligible to actually intelligible, which completes the act of knowledge. And this is made possible by the active or the agent intellect. This is one dimension of the intellect that St. Thomas talks about. It's made possible by this active or agent intellect that each rational soul is endowed with by virtue of its being made in the image and likeness of God. And the active intellect is going to take what is present within the passive intellect and abstract from that the forms that are contained in creation itself, in the material order. So while human beings do come to knowledge in and through sensation and the sensible phantasms that generate in the imagination upon the mind's engagement with sensible objects, while it is, of course, the order of knowledge, there is already a pre-established basis for a mutual interrelationship between what is immaterial in the mind and what is immaterial in the thing known, in the known object. And this is ultimately what's going to make human knowledge possible in the first place. Otherwise, there would be no way for the knowing subject to attain any kind of true unity with the thing known, which is absolutely required for an authentic act of knowledge. It's only because of this metaphysical familiarity, as it were, that the mind has with the known object a true unity between knower and known. And this is absolutely essential, or else there's always going to be some barrier between the knowing subject and the object known, if there's no true unity that obtains between them. So the tree, for example, can, on this view, actually become one with the mind, not because the physical tree enters into our imagination physically, obviously, but because its form, as a potentially intelligible species, agrees in its immateriality with the immaterial agent intellect of the knower. And it's this metaphysical compatibility that brings about true knowledge of reality for the human knowing subject. So what we can establish here is that epistemological realism ultimately follows upon metaphysical realism. Not just any metaphysical realism, but this hylomorphic realism in particular, where there's form and matter, which constitute the essence of a thing. Because only hylomorphic realism is able to account for the true materiality of the tree, while also accounting for the precise way in which the human mind and the tree can come together in unity for an act of knowledge to be accomplished. It's because while the tree is not altogether immaterial, so this isn't an idealism, it is partially immaterial. And this partial immateriality is going to be what undergirds its intelligibility. And so there is, in other words, already a conceptual element in the thing itself ready to be cognized by a mental act of the knowing subject. As Cardinal Ratzinger even pointed out, this is why we use the word recognition, because we think again those forms, or we could call, as St. Maximus would say, logoi of the divine logos. We think again those logoi that are permeated throughout all of creation already. Unless one think this is just a matter of just more metaphysical speculation, this should be thought of, I think, more along the lines of a transcendental argument, whereby we acknowledge what the actual preconditions are for establishing a true act of knowledge. So what are the necessary preconditions for a true act of knowledge to obtain? Which absolutely have to be conceded if we're going to engage in any philosophy at all. And my claim here is that hylomorphic metaphysical realism is that precondition which makes true knowledge possible, while also accepting what intuition would demand, which is the authentic materiality of physical substances, so avoiding idealism on the other end of this. So, in other words, knowledge is only possible because there is a true union between the knowing subject and the object known that has to be true in order to have a genuine act of knowledge. But this union is only possible because there's a mutually agreeable plane upon which the mind and the known subject can interact with each other. And this further is only possible if we concede a hylomorphic account of physical reality, which acknowledges that conceptual content is already present within the material substances themselves, which the mind can then abstract by the operation of the active intellect. And so on this view, metaphysics is possible because, in a way, the senses, upon perceiving a material object, the senses are also interacting with the full ontological structure of that physical substance in both its material and immaterial dimensions. And of course, this leads to another epistemological concern that Patron had. And this concerns the degree to which we can trust the logical laws that serve as the basis for all of our other metaphysical arguments. And he approached this objection from the standpoint of like an evolutionary account of biodiversity, that if we come as a result of this evolutionary process, how is it that we can trust our cognitive faculties that may have come as a result of random mutation and natural selection? I mean, I would quite agree. I think that if your account of human origins is reducible to that, narrative, it becomes very difficult. But if, on the other hand, we recognize the human mind as being an endowment of the human person, in other words, it's given from above, well then, and if we also acknowledge that there is this immaterial component within creation itself, well then there's no issue. There's no issue at all. Even if there is some evolutionary history to perhaps the development of the human body, what we can recognize is that the endowment of the human intellect as an immaterial subsistence would therefore, that endowment, that supernatural endowment, would make that a non-issue, because it would bring into right alignment the human mind on the one hand and the conceptual content that is imbued in creation on the other hand. But getting back to this issue of logical laws, I mean, there's an easy answer to this that I think everyone brings up, but there's also an answer that bears a little bit more relevance to what we've been discussing. And now the easy answer, of course, is to appeal to the self-undermining nature of the question, right? If we cannot trust the reliability of logical laws, then to even question their reliability is going to presuppose the validity of those laws in the first place, and so we shouldn't waste our time with this kind of radical skepticism. But at a deeper level, however, I think we can relate our answer to what we have already been expressing a moment ago, and that is because the mind immediately intuits being. Remember, the human intellect, as we've discussed, because of its immateriality, it doesn't exist for the sake of the body. So what can it exist for the sake of? What is it therefore open to? Universal being, the universal scope of being. Because it's not, its existence isn't merely for the sake of informing matter. It has subsistence in its own right, and so it has an object that is likewise immaterial. And so its immediate object of knowledge is going to be the universal scope of being. And so, because that's baked into the ontological structure of the human intellect, then there's already an immediate engagement with what those logical laws are really rooted in. So the mind's first object of knowledge, therefore, is the very ontological foundation of all these logical laws in the first place. I mean, all logical laws, it seems to me, are ultimately just derivations of the unity of being as the principles of being, which are filtered through the discursive processes of our mental activity. And so if we can concede that the first object of the mind's act of knowledge is being, then that in itself is going to safeguard all the logical laws that flow from the mind's immediate apprehension of being. And so again, we have the hylomorphic structure of reality providing a more robust account for how these logical laws can be relied on in the mind's search for truth. And so those are just some reflections that I had on this question. And if the patron thing wants to ask other questions, side questions, follow-up questions, I'll do another one of these videos. But I hope this was helpful. I hope it wasn't too all over the place. I just kind of wanted to give a good account of the dynamics that come into play with the act of knowledge from a Thomistic standpoint. And again, I think that once it's explained more for what it is, it immediately takes on a bit of a persuasive force. So, I mean, if you want to see more videos where I take on more of an apologetic approach to taking on more concrete, specific, skeptical objections, I'll be happy to do that. But I kind of just wanted this to be an overall description of the Thomistic theory of knowledge, so that hopefully you can appreciate our brand of realism a little bit better. So hope that was helpful. Again, if you want to support the stream, if you want to support my content, my video content especially, you can become a patron, patreon.com/classicaltheist. I'm going to be doing more streams and more content in the next few weeks, and beyond. I got a lot of stuff lined up. So if you like this video, give it a like, comment what you thought, any questions, those are welcome too. Support in the comments is always helpful. And yeah, God bless you. Have a wonderful upcoming Holy Week. But you'll probably see some content within the week as well. God bless you.